After 9 rounds in the candidates tournament, Vladimir Kramnik and Levon Aronian were at the bottom of the tournament table. Who'd have thought that? With 3.5 points, along with Wesley So. Extraordinary to think of those three languishing in the tournament. In the 10th round, Kramnik and Aronian faced each other, two big wounded beasts. And their game did not disappoint. It seems as though they both have nothing more to lose and they're just slugging it out now. So, without further ado, let's join the game after 16 moves. Kramnik with the white pieces. Now, he played a gioco piano and the opening was pretty quiet. He said after the game that he was just wanted to play something where he could, something very solid and safe. And then things developed. Well, here the position is about even. Kramnik has played his bishop to e3, and that was exchanged off for this bishop on this diagonal, so that's a pretty normal trade. And Aronian could have played here rook e8, with the simple idea of playing bishop e6 to trade off that dangerous bishop. And I think we could say the position's around even. But Levon said afterwards that he wanted to keep more play in the position. He wanted to test white, and he played b5. He felt that he had a pleasant initiative on the queen side because he wanted to break, open the position. He can use his pawns, and potentially there is a problem for white with these double pawns. If black ever manages to steam through with c4, then he could be able to isolate those double pawns. And now interesting things happened. Queen c3, slightly unusual move, but hitting this pawn, and after bishop d7, rook f2. So this bishop has been detained here and isn't going to shut out the bishop. Queen b6 from Aronian, hitting the pawn on e3. So that looks a bit painful after a very normal move like queen b6, that Kramnik has to make a move just defending that pawn. But there is a disadvantage to playing queen b6, and that is that the queen is a long way from the king side. That could be significant. Now here Aronian played rook e8, which really surprised me. I mean, that is casual, or it shows enormous confidence, or just a little bit too casual. It's certainly very provocative because moving the rook has moved away from covering that slightly weak point on f7. But what he wants to do is lend more support to this pawn in preparation for breaking with c5. And now Kramnik goes on the attack. Knight h4. Sometimes the knight will hop in here, sometimes here, but of course, main thing is it opens up the f-file and already introduces the idea of simply sacrificing the exchange on f6 to break up black's king position. So, looks like a pretty standard move, but of course, Aronian had anticipated this. I would say he even provoked this move because he was confident that his counterattack on the queen side would bring dividends. Now the rook moves over, now that the queen is no longer hitting the pawn here. And if Aronian wants to put the brakes on, then he could trade here and play c4, lock out that bishop for a moment. And after this, it's a fairly forcing line, but he's going to trade off bishops. And, well, in this case, black should be able to level the position, considering that white has to take care of all those pawns. But instead of that, he kept just raising the stakes. He took on b4. Now, white's problem is, of course, you would like to recapture, but this pawn is on prise. Probably we throw in a4 first, a4 bishop a2, and then take the pawn, and that's disastrous for white. So after c takes b4, incredibly, Kramnik just ignored this and brought his queen back. I mean, this is such a crude way of playing the position. He allows black to take a pawn with tempo just to retreat the queen to cover this pawn. Of course, it's not just about covering the pawn. The queen is now able, in some circumstances, to bounce to the king side, because this is always in the air, this exchange sack. So, for example, if pawn takes pawn, then we sack and take on f6, threat here on f7, also h6, and after queen g3 check, then knight f5, and that's immediately crushing, threatening queen g7. Therefore, Aronian shut out the bishop with d5. And here, already, the exchange sack is very interesting, and just to take back with the bishop on d5, it's possible, but Kramnik took back on b4, and if a4, then he can just take that pawn, and that's nice for white. So Aronian continued in his uncompromising way by taking on e4, but of course that opens up the bishop. And now Kramnik played, I think, a good move. Once again, he could contemplate the sacrifice on f6. You could take on f6 and even just recapture here. And certainly white has good compensation. But Kramnik had seen something else. And actually, this is very clever. After pawn takes pawn, if queen takes, then he just wanted to duck to the side, avoid the queen trade. And in that way, black's queen is very much sidelined here. It's even further away from the king side, particularly now that it's not covering f6. And that queen is ready to leap over into the attack. So Aronian, after pawn takes pawn, recaptured with the rook. And the reason I think Kramnik did very well in going for this is that this rook now looks very awkwardly placed. It's really going nowhere from this position. And again, I think sacking the exchange here is reasonable, but Kramnik had seen something else, knight g6, and this is a great move. And that actually clears, in some circumstances, the h4 square for the queen. And here, well, I think it seemed, I mean, maybe with the benefit of hindsight, that rook should come back into play. So just put it on a6 or a7 or a8. I think all those squares will help black's defense. I mean, I suppose a6 and a7 are the obvious ones to cover up these sensitive points. But instead, Aronian went for bishop e6. Fine, he wanted to cut out the bishop. And now, look how Kramnik played. Kramnik played knight takes e5. Again, I don't know how he managed to resist the temptation to sacrifice on f6, because this is the obvious move. I mean, what he did was very, very clever, but this is also really interesting. One could play like this. Now, obviously, pawn takes knight, queen takes, and this is crashing through for white. The rook will join the attack as well. So, pawn takes pawn, and now rook f6. And now d2. Okay, I'm going to show you a very long computery variation, so bear with me. But the reason I'm doing this is because it's so entertaining. So watch this. Check. So the king ducks to f8. Knight f5. So threatening queen g7 mate, and if bishop takes knight, then rook f7. Well, the queen's on prise, but that's checkmate. However, this does allow black to make a queen. So black has two queens on the board. It's incredible. That rook e7 allows the king to run now. But white's attack continues. It's very nice that white's king is completely safe here. So actually the queens can't do a lot here. And white actually manages to recover material here, like this, and like this, and manages to take on e6. And I mean, white just has fantastic compensation in this position. The queen can come back to defend, but well, knight and 2 pawns against a rook. Of course, that can't be taken because of queen b6 with a double attack. And black's king is still staggering around in the middle of the board. So, well, it's a mad variation. It's certainly not winning for white, but it just shows it is possible to take on f6. But Kramnik played a really clever move. Knight takes pawn. And if bishop takes bishop here, let's see that, then rook takes knight. And now the knight comes in, and that's already looking very good for white, hitting the queen, and then you can bounce back and take here as well. So after knight takes pawn here, Aronian played pawn takes pawn. Well, that is a lot healthier if after this you can actually take a whole bishop. But Kramnik finally sacked on f6 and simply recaptured with the rook. So, okay, let's take a material count. White is the exchange down now, and black's king is, well, pretty exposed. Aronian played d2. And if this is taken, as we would like to eliminate a pawn on the 7th rank, then check. And now queen a5, and that's problematic for white. The attack isn't as strong now because the queen, of course, has to keep defending e1 or trade, and, well, black is fine there. Or in this position, if after the check, if king h2, then queen b8 pins, and yeah, it slows down the whole attack. So in this position, after d2, Kramnik now found a remarkable idea. He had anticipated this. Check. And this contains an incredible trap. Obviously, if king goes in the corner, then rook h6 mate. And if king h7, there is an absolutely stunning winning move, which both players had seen. c4. So that prevents black queening with check and sets up bishop c2, and that's gonna be mate. Absolutely remarkable move. So after queen g3 check, king f8, and now there's still a potential problem with this. So Kramnik just moved the rook back. Now I find this remarkable that he actually realised that his attack was still fantastically strong, even though he has to expend a whole tempo to just prevent black queening. This is an extraordinary concept. So the rook came back to a7. And then knight g6 check. So obviously rook a7 was to defend f7. And now the knight pirouetted round. If king h7, then knight h5 is winning, threatening these two things. So after knight f4 and check, then the king went to h8. Knight h5. Queen here threatened, and if rook g8 here, and, well, knight f6 must be winning. I dare say c4 is, and bishop c2 is also very good, but anyway, knight f6 is good. So after knight h5, f6 played, so that the rook can defend along the 7th rank, and that got taken. of course, there's massive time pressure going on here, which is not easy for both players. Aronian said after the game, I had a zillion options here. Well, it's not so clear, actually. He just clearly felt he was safe once the rook is able to defend along the 7th rank. But it's not that clear. One could play rook d8 here. This is possible. But, in fact, white is still okay in this position. Queen h6 threatened. Let's take that off. Queen. Knight f6. I mean, this is a hilarious variation. So coming back to play queen h6. And in this position, black actually manages to force the queens off, and that should be a draw. White will pick that one up. Still fantastically complicated. Aronian played rook f8, which is actually fine. So he's just making sure that that keeps white on his toes with this pin, and there's also this pawn here. Queen f4, threatening mate. So the rook swings across. Of course, that can't be taken because the queen is on. Queen e5. And this is the moment of truth. Here, Aronian played queen c7. It would have been a bit better to play rook g7. And it's funny, both players thought that they were the ones playing for the win here. I guess they both are. But it just shows that they're both so optimistic, such self-confidence. Queen c6, I mean, they were discussing this variation afterwards. So mate threatened. And white has to be very careful with this pawn hanging over, hanging over him. So, for example, well, they discussed this variation afterwards. Bishop g4, and after this, well, they're going to liquidate to a draw here, basically. But instead of rook g7, Aronian played queen c7. Disaster. Knight e8 check. And that was the end of the game. So it's check from the queen. And if queen takes queen, we have rook takes rook check. The bishop has to go in the way, and rook takes bishop is mate, supported by the bishop on b3 that Aronian failed to eliminate earlier in the game. He knew what he was doing. He knew he was taking a risk. Both players knew that they were taking risks in this game. And they produced something really special. Absolutely superb game. So finally, Kramnik's optimism pays off. So that brings him up to 4.5 in the tournament. 4.5 out of 10. And poor old Levon at the bottom of the table with 3.5. If you want to see what happened in the top clash between Mamedyarov and Caruana, then please do click through. You should see a link at the end of the video, if not now. And don't forget to like and comment, and thanks for watching.